But yeah, we're starting to get a nice sky, so I'm going to get some shots. And I might even put on a filter to show you how we can do long exposures in Aperture Priority. Once you find where your exposure compensation is, all you need to do is either turn your dial to overexpose or turn your dial to underexpose. You can still use your histogram. So now just by changing our aperture, we can change our shutter speed, and the camera's keeping our base exposure where it should be. Hello and thank you for joining me. So if you do like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It gives me an idea of what people want to see. Now this channel is all about simple and effective, and today we're going to cover Aperture Priority because I think that's a really good way of starting in photography. Okay, before we go into manual mode and we work out the exposure triangle, Aperture Priority gets us out shooting nice and quickly and effectively. Okay, then we can worry about composition and actually framing up our shot. Okay, so the way Aperture Priority works is you set your aperture in your camera. You can also set your ISO. Then the camera will calculate your shutter speed and give you a base exposure. Okay, so it will expose everything correctly based on your aperture and your ISO. And it's literally point and shoot. The only thing you need to keep an eye on is if your shutter speed drops too slow, you can either bump up your ISO to create that faster shutter speed, or just put your camera on a tripod. So that's what I do. I tend to shoot at my lowest ISO, so 100, and if my shutter speed starts to get too slow to hand hold, I just put it on a tripod. Now, a couple of things we need to know with Aperture Priority, and the first one is our metering mode. Okay, so the metering mode is going to tell the camera what to expose for. Okay, so we've got a few different metering modes in our cameras. In Canon, it's called an evaluate metering, and that's the one I'm going to be using. Okay, we don't want to use spot metering. We don't want to use partial metering. We want to choose evaluate. Okay, because we're doing a sunset, evaluate metering is going to take in the whole scene. So it's going to see that bright sun, it's going to see our dark shadows, and it's going to try and get an exposure that takes a little bit of both and gives us the best exposure the camera can possibly do in one shot. We also have what's called exposure compensation. Again, every camera is slightly different, but it all works the same way. So you might need to have a look at your manual or have a look at a YouTube video to see how your camera does exposure compensation. And what we can do is we can deliberately overexpose or we can deliberately underexpose just with the turn of a dial. Okay, so you can map it to whichever dial you want on your camera. Okay, and it just makes it very easy. As you'll see in the video, I can just turn the dial, underexpose, overexpose, or just leave it as a base exposure. That's all you really need to know for Aperture Priority to start with. Okay, set your aperture, set your ISO, and find your exposure compensation. You know what, today we're going to shoot in Aperture Priority. I highly recommend, if you're just starting out and manual mode gets a bit too confusing for you, I have done some videos on how to use manual mode, but to save time, Aperture Priority is a good starting point because all you need to do is worry about your aperture and the camera will calculate the shutter speed for you. And you know, we're still a fair way off sunset. So what I'm going to do is just set my camera to f8. Okay, f8's a good sort of mid-ground for our sunsets. We're not getting too close to the foreground for these shots. So f8, Aperture Priority, and ISO at 100. Once the sun gets a bit lower, we'll get some nice long exposures, and we'll move around. There's some nicer rocks just off to our right here, which will make for a much more interesting shot. But yeah, just having some foreground, okay, some nice foreground interest, and everything's curling around the beach up towards our sunset, and just some rocks leading out towards our sunset. Okay, so very basic, simple composition, but quite effective. Okay, so just change location. Now I'm going to really get these rocks. Okay, so I do like to have rocks in my foreground. Now we don't have any big waves or anything like that, so that's why shooting in Aperture Priority, very easy. We don't need to worry about shutter speed. We can just let the camera do it. I will do another video where we have waves and we want to create a shutter speed to get motion in our water, okay? Because we don't have any big waves, we don't really need any movement. The reflections are quite nice, so today's all about easy, okay? Aperture priority, nice and easy. Takes the thinking out of it, okay? Set your aperture, set your ISO, let the camera work out the rest. Okay, so got some nice rocks down here. I'm just going to, once again, just frame it up. I'm just focusing around about halfway into my frame. Okay, and using this rock on this side just as our leading line. Now, one thing you will notice that the photos will appear very dark on the camera, okay? Don't worry too much about it dark. We're exposing for our sky, we're exposing for our sunset, so naturally our foreground is going to be a little bit darker because that sky is so bright. So if you're on your evaluate metering, don't worry too much about your foreground. It's leading lines, okay? It's not all about foreground interest. It's all about getting some nice leading lines just to make our sunset look a little bit nicer. Okay, so now we're on the tripod, we're all set for sunset. So I'm just going to fire off a few shots again, just in aperture priority. Okay, so I'll show you the back of the camera. And as you can see, our foreground is very dark. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that shot there because I can see by my histogram, everything looks fine. And then what I'm going to do with my exposure compensation, this one here, I'm turning this up to +1 stop. Okay, I might even go up a little bit more. Go up to +2. So then we can blend them together. Okay, check that out. That's really nice sunset. So again, just aperture priority and letting the camera work out our shutter speed. Now, one thing to keep an eye on is keep an eye on this tide. As the tide comes in, the sand will shift. Okay, so if we get long exposures, just make sure your tripod's nice and sturdy. Once that water hits the tripod, it will start to sink. Okay, so that's one thing to keep mindful of and keep an eye on. So similar to what I did before, I'm going to do multiple exposures. Okay, got a nice little reflection pool right in front here. I'm going to get a little bit more sky. Okay, it's all about that leading line. Okay, it's not the most amazing location in the world, but it's nice. Okay, and that's what it's all about. Just work with what you've got. Okay, we can't all afford to go over to these epic locations. So work with what you've got and you'll find that you'll find some nice photographs just in your local area. Find a beach with some rocks, okay, and you'll get some nice shots. Have a look at that sky, okay? Things are starting to look nice now. I'm blocking out the sun, but yeah, we're starting to get a nice sky, so I'm going to get some shots. And I might even put on a filter to show you how we can do long exposures in aperture priority. Okay, so I've put on an ND64. So what that's going to do is just smooth out the water and let us get longer exposures. So ND64 cuts out 6 stops of light. So that'll get our exposure longer. So what I'll do is I'll show you the back of the camera again and show you how easy it is in aperture priority to let the camera calculate your exposure and don't have to think about shutter speed. Okay, so exactly the same as before, but if we have a look now look at our shutter speed. It's at 3.2 seconds. Okay, so even with aperture priority, the camera will calculate our exposure. It's only when you get the really big, heavy filters on that the camera starts to struggle. Okay, so now what we can do, I'm just going to do one exposure for our sky at 2.5 seconds. Okay, and now I'm going to, oops, wrong one, deliberately overexpose quite a bit, and now we're at a 13-second exposure. Okay, so I'll take that shot. That's just going to smooth the water out a lot nicer for us. Okay, and again, if you just want to get it all in one exposure, just watch your little exposure dial. And we're trying to get this dial at the bottom right in the middle. That's our base exposure. Okay, so I'm going to take a shot there now. And aperture priority, the camera is calculating our shutter speed. All we're worrying about is our aperture, our ISO, and the camera will calculate the shutter speed for us. Okay, and that's looking really nice. Okay, so I'll show you another really cool trick with aperture priority. So let's just say at the moment our base exposure is at 4 seconds. If we want to get a longer exposure, all we're going to do is take our aperture up. So if we go up to say f16, now the camera's telling us our base exposure is at 15 seconds. So now just by changing our aperture, we can change our shutter speed and the camera's keeping our base exposure where it should be. Okay, so I'm going to go up to f16 and get a nice 15-second exposure. Okay, and then if we want to get an even longer exposure, let's go all the way up to f22. Now f22, I don't really recommend going all the way up to f22. but let's do it just for the sake of the video. And now we're going to get a nice 30-second exposure, which is really starting to enter that long exposure territory. Okay, so we're just after sunset, and look, when you don't have high cloud and you got cloud on the horizon, you do lose colour. Okay, everything's going to go a little bit grey. We've kind of, the sun didn't get up and light up all this cloud for us. So what we're going to do is wait. Okay, never be too impatient and leave early. Okay, once the colour disappears, hang around and you watch what happens once the sun gets down into the twilight or the blue hour. Okay, and now blue hour. Welcome to blue hour. So look at all that colour that we've got. So it went from all grey, and now we've got lots of colour. So this is where long exposures look just incredible. So I'm going to get some shots, and then I'll see you in the editing room very shortly. Okay, so I'll just show you the back of the camera. So very similar to what we were doing before. I've got my aperture set to f14 because then what I can do, if I overexpose, we can get up to 30 seconds. Okay, so even in aperture priority, we can still control our shutter speed just by using our under and overexposure down here. Okay, so I'm going to deliberately overexpose that one at 30 seconds. So that's going to be my foreground shot. And now all I'm going to do is just underexpose, and what that will do is speed up my shutter speed. So I'm going to underexpose, get those highlights under control. Okay, so even with aperture priority, we've still got plenty of control. So now that it's getting dark, I'm just going to turn my aperture down to f10. Okay, and similar to before, if we just want to get that base exposure, which is a little bit of both, just try and get your dial as close to the middle as possible. Let the camera calculate what it's doing. And in this case, with sunsets, I tend to just underexpose a little bit. It's just going to give us some more colour in that sky. So just by underexpose by about one stop, we'll take that shot, and that's going to be our base exposure. And yeah, underexposing by one stop, it retains all that colour in the sky. Okay, now onto the editing side of things. I'm going to keep this very short and simple because I'll save my editing videos and make them a bit more dedicated and go a little bit more in depth. But what we'll have a look at here is our base exposures, our underexposures, and our overexposures. So if I put my clipping warnings on, this is a base exposure where the camera has just used its evaluate metering to try and take in as much information as it can. And it's done a pretty good job. Okay, shooting into the sun is not the easiest thing in the world to do. So the camera it's blown our highlights a little bit, as we can see in red, okay, and it's clipped our shadows a little bit, as we can see in blue. But that's not the end of the world, okay? So this is a raw file. A JPEG will probably process a little bit nicer. So if your camera is set up to shoot in JPEG, you'll probably find that the camera will do a little bit of in-camera processing and make it look a little bit more like this, where it's going to just increase your dynamic range a little bit in camera. With an image like this, I like to change my profile to Adobe Landscape. It's going to boost the colors a little bit, boost our dynamic range a little bit, and just make it look nicer. Okay, all we need to do is just bring down our highlights a little bit, lift our shadows a little bit. We can still see that there's a lot of black in the image, so I'd be quite happy just to bring our blacks up a little bit. Okay, and there's a good starting point. So if we have a look at the before and then the after, okay, we're bringing it out to a nicer place, and that's a base exposure. Okay, so that's not going to do a full workflow with this one. That's kind of just a good starting point. Bring down our highlights, lift our shadows. Now, if we have a look at our multiple exposures, and this is where exposure compensation can be really good, because if you want to get those long exposures and really smooth out that water, by overexposing, we're creating a longer shutter speed, so we're getting that nice smooth water, okay? But our sky has blown out. So we've created the long exposure that we want with that silky smooth water. So that's when we do another exposure and for our sky, okay? And then we can blend them both together, which is what we'll do shortly. Okay, so that's a good reason to do multiple exposures. One is if you want that long exposure and you want to get all that detail and smoothness in your water, all the detail in the rocks. If we look over here, there's plenty of detail there because we've overexposed, we've captured all that shadow detail. If we have a look at this one, we've lost all that shadow detail, okay, but we've retained most of our sky. Okay, so it's a good, look, it's the best of both worlds. You're getting nice long shutter speed, you're getting all this detail in our foreground, and you're getting detail in your sky. Where if we go with a base exposure, sort of more like this one, it's a compromise, okay? You're compromising your shadows, you're compromising your highlights. Now, exposure blending in Lightroom is really easy these days. All we really need to do is if we just select those two images, so I'm going to click on the first one, hold my Control or Command button, select the second one, and then if we just right click, Photo Merge and HDR. Now, it's not perfect. Photoshop does a much better job. I've got plenty of videos on exposure blending, but as far as Lightroom goes, Lightroom does a good job. Now, because I'm on a tripod, I don't need to align my images. The auto settings doesn't really matter whether you use them or not. When it comes to deghosting, leave it on none. Trust me, I've tried it. I've done other videos. Leave that on none, and it does the nicest blend of the three. Okay, and then we just hit merge. And what it's going to do is it's going to take the best parts of those two images and blend them together and create a new file. So this is a DNG file. Okay, so if we have a look at this image, for example, we've got all this nice smooth water here. And then if we look at this one, it's pulled all that smooth water out, but it's also taken our sky exposure, okay, and it's blended them together. Okay, now, like I said, Photoshop does a better job, but Lightroom does a good job. Okay, so from here we can do exactly what we did before. We can bring down our highlights, lift our shadows, and we're retaining all that detail. But more importantly, we're getting the two exposures. We're getting our long exposure for our foreground, and we're getting our faster exposure for our sky. So then we've got all that detail in the sky. And then if we just do a layer mask, for example, and what I'm going to do is grab my linear gradient. I'm going to bring my exposure up by around about a stop, and then with my linear gradient, I'm just going to drag up, and then we've got all that detail in our foreground. Okay, so the best of both worlds. By doing multiple exposures, we're getting the best of both worlds. Okay, so we're taking a little bit from our long exposure, we're taking a little bit from our sky exposure, and we're putting them together to create the image. Now, again, I'm not going to do a full workflow on this one. This is just to give you some ideas. And then finally, if I just go back to my filters, what I'm going to do is have a look at our last image. So these are the ones in the blue hour. And as you can see here, we've got a really large dynamic range. So our sky is perfectly exposed and we've lost all this detail in our foreground. If we have a look at our foreground exposure, okay, we're still fairly dark, but we've got plenty of detail in our foreground, but we've lost our sky. The base exposure, so this I sort of explained the base exposure by underexposing by about one stop. What we've done, we've retained all that detail in our sky and we've captured most of our foreground. Okay, so this one I'm just going to do in one edit. We're going to just develop one photo. We're not going to do our blend. Like I said, I've done plenty of videos on blending and I'll do plenty more, so stay tuned for some more of them. This one, I just want to keep it simple, okay? There, one exposure, one base exposure. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this one to Adobe Landscape. And all I really want to do is, look, let's bring down our highlights a little bit first to get back some detail in our sky. We're going to lift our shadows a little bit to get some detail in our foreground. And we're going to lift our blacks as well, make the image fairly flat. So now we're starting to get some more detail in our foreground. And finally, if we just add some contrast, contrast will boost our blacks and our whites and our color. Okay, and then just play around with exposure until we get it to somewhere where we like it. Okay, again, what I'm going to do with this one, I'm just going to lift it up by about a stop and a half. Now my sky is too bright, so I'm going to reduce that sky with our masking tools and a linear gradient. And I'm just going to drag this down, get it sort of roughly on my horizon, and then bring that exposure for the sky back down. And that's it, okay? And you'll hear me say this a lot, that a good photo is a good photo. You shouldn't have to do a lot to it. Okay, so if we have a look at where that started with our base exposure and where we've taken it just with a few sliders. Okay, so again, there's a lot more we can do, but this was more about using Aperture Priority and showing you the difference between an underexposed and overexposed and a base exposure. Okay, so for social media, a base exposure is absolutely fine. No one's going to notice all the noise and things that we've created in our darker areas, which I'll cover that in another video. Okay, base exposure, you're going to, there's compromises. Okay, that's very noisy down here. I don't know how well YouTube will pick it up. Where if we have a look at our overexposed or our exposed for the shadows, it's just going to be a lot cleaner. Okay, that is a lot cleaner. There's no noise whatsoever. Our base exposure, we've had to push the image to its limits, which, like I said, social media, absolutely fine. No one's going to notice. Print the image big, you might run into some issues. That's about it for this one. So a very simple, basic edit. Like I said, I'll do plenty of videos on editing, and I'm planning a full workflow soon. So what I'm going to do is go out, do a shoot, an edit, and a print. Okay, and I'll show you exactly my process of capturing an image, editing the image, and then printing the image. So I will do that shortly, and that's going to be a lot more in-depth, because when it comes to printing, things like hot pixels, dust spots, we're going to spend a lot of time getting that image prepared to print, where this is just a simple get you started, and simple and effective. That's why I'm here. You shouldn't have to edit your images a lot to make them look nice. Okay, there's a lot more we can do, but we don't need to. All right, so that's it. Hopefully you did like it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, if you subscribe and click the notification bell, you will see me live. I do live streams fairly regularly. By the time you watch this video, I will probably have my next live stream planned. And it's me out in the field talking crap and taking photos. So if that's the sort of thing that you like, yeah, subscribe and come and watch me live. Good little community we've got, so people will get in the chat, say hello, chat, ask questions. Yeah, good fun. Okay, so that's it for this one. Hopefully you did like it, and I will see you live very shortly.